Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discussing on restoring security and peace. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David Smith, Professor Donald and Professor Rob. First, I would like to give chance Professor David Smith.
Sharif, thank you for pulling this topic together today and putting together a very good panel around it. Restoring security and peace is something that we're seeing more and more. It was a major topic at the UN Davos meeting recently and has been the topic of many others. And quite a few world leaders have spoken out on this topic in just the last several months. So it's one that is timely. Um, the war in Ukraine, uh, the potential of conflict in other parts of the world are highlighting the importance of this topic really there. And you begin to see that the war in Ukraine really has taken and been a major shock factor to a really very fragile geopolitical and security landscape we've been operating under for the last, oh, 5 to 10 years. Um, and one of the consensus as you look at this topic is bold leadership is required to not only restore peace and security in Europe, but also around the world. How can you begin to do it in Asia with PRC and what's happening there? How can you do it in other parts of the world and where uh, you see Pakistan, India, and the areas there. How can we do it as you look at the Middle East? So there's many places where this type of bold leadership is needed to restore peace, security, and add stabilization of it. So, one of the big questions here is in time of grave challenges like this, and I'd call this a grave challenge, is how can you begin to, as citizens, as leaders, and others, begin to look at how you restore security and peace. Um, Going back to Davos with their annual meeting, in the plenary session, the Secretary General stressed that NATO allies have provided unprecedented support to help Ukraine uphold its right of self-defense, and um, and he made the comment that weapons are the way to peace in Europe. And what happens around the negotiation table is totally dependent on the strength of the battlefield. And if he wanted Ukraine to prevail, then they need the military strength, is what he said in there. Uh, the Secretary General and Davos in his talk on restoring uh, security and peace went on to say that it's something that is needed around the world and how to put the pieces in place, and that uh, the ability to have peace, to have democracy, to have uh, the rule of national law recognized for peace is something that is extremely important. Uh, and that it's at a tipping point right now, and it can be very dangerous for all of us. Um, and he also made the point that a lot of security and peace is being undermined by authoritarian leaders, and that they use brutal force when they violate international law, and that there is a requirement for us to do this, to go back and respect the rule of international law, to respect what's there, to honor agreements that were made in the past. And we're seeing international treaties, uh, international order of law being violated many places. You've heard the mention, for example, in Ukraine, of war crimes being investigated and populated. And restoring security and peace has to take into account all of these areas and the underlying goals there. Uh, I'm going back to a former president in the United States who some people agreed with, some did not. But Ronald Reagan was quoted as saying there, you want to trust but verify. And trust but verify is not a bad concept when you look at how you restore security and peace. you need to put the elements in, you need to put the uh, treaties, the laws, respect them in place, but you need to trust but verify that they're being followed. And we're seeing that time and time again as some of these actions and the things that are being done. To restore security and peace takes a world that can work together to do it. If you have major forces who decide to use brute force to get what they want, it's going to be difficult to restore security and peace. So you have to have society come together, governments come together, NGOs come together to be able to drive the requirements for restoring security and peace. So, Sharif, that's my opening.
Thank you. Professor Donald, what you want to add about peace and security, and if you want to share some of your view about Russia and Ukraine war, and what will be the impact in the future, and how we can overcome from this situation.
Well, one thing, it's hard to restore something that, at least globally, we've never had. And um, I want to just say about peace and security, to kind of build on something that David just said, is that we, in sociology and social science, one of the things that we think about that's a difficult problem is what we call the micro macro problem. And what that is that we realize that nations or companies or organizations or teams or families or anything like that we identify are made up of individual people. So it's in a way, it seems like there should be some possible way to describe societies, everything that goes on in society is in terms of individual people, and that's what economics tries to do, and very badly in some circumstances. It just can't do it. And but then from the because if you really think about it at a macro level, things like nation, it's kind of silly to say that the Internal Revenue Service, that America, the United States, that these things don't exist, because we see them as existing. Even though we can't touch them or feel them, they have consequences on our lives. And so what happens is when you have what is a nation? A nation is something. It's in a way a belief that you share with other people around you, and it causes you to act in certain ways and feel certain things and behave in certain ways. So when you look at Ukraine, it's an interesting thing that, just from what I'm saying, one of the things that's going on is Russia is claiming that no, there is no nation called Ukraine. Ukraine is actually part of Russia. There's no nation. At least big chunks of Ukraine have a lot of Russian-speaking people in them, and they have been part of Soviet Union, and so therefore they aren't independent countries. So there's no reason for Russia not to be able to go in and defend their own country. Ukrainians don't agree with that. They think, well, no, this is our country and our belief about the country. So in a sense, you see that there's like different beliefs are fighting almost. And so the question is how do you get to change those different beliefs? And the reason I'm saying it is because that happens all over the world. Kashmir is considered to be, different countries kind of lay claim on it, and it's just one example of the kind of thing that can happen. And then also the structure of your government is something that people think, what is a government? What is a government should be like? And some people have just grown up and lived with authoritarian governments. And when they think of a government, they think of a government as somebody that runs the government and as an authoritarian. And then some countries have evolved, like not like Finland and Denmark and the Nordic countries have evolved to become very democratic. And they think of the government as somebody who works for them. That's basically their employees that are working together for their benefit to provide them services that they can't do as individuals. And so when you're looking at the idea of world peace and security, you're faced with a kind of fundamental thing that people just don't see the idea of what a nation is or the world in the same way. So, and one more example on that, and then I'll get back to Ukraine, is that when I was really in my whole life, I've traveled, I've been fortunate enough to go to a lot of places, and I have, like every day I'm on Zoom or phone calls with people in Europe and Africa and all over the place. And it's a really wonderful thing. And as far as I'm concerned, it's one world, and we should all be working together to try and figure out how we could, make things work best for everybody. But right now, there's really strong forces of nationalism taking place in a lot of countries, including the United States. And there's a group of people who consider that to be New World Order, the whole idea of globalization and things like that are evil and bad, and we should put America first and all this kind of stuff. And it's just because their concept in their head of what a country is and what the world is different than the concept in my head of what a country is and what the world is. And that's kind of the micro aspect of the problem, is that every individual is going to wind up having their own view. Usually, I mean, it won't be totally their own. It'll be their friends and their social circles will share that view. Their culture, microculture, will share that view. So getting back to Ukraine, I mean, personally, I thought it was pretty rotten of Russia to attack them, and I thought it was pretty rotten of Russia to attack them and take Crimea when they did in 2014. And so I really like the Russian people. When I was in Russia, they're very, very warm people, and they've lived in such hardship for so long that they have this beautiful way of taking care of each other. That's just it's beautiful, really. And and having this war doesn't help them either. It doesn't help them. It's not any benefit to the Russian people. So, but when I was in Turkey, I was in Turkey when Yeltsin died. Is that Yeltsin? Boris Yeltsin. And I was sitting in a couch in the hotel I was staying at, watching his funeral on TV. And there's a Russian guy sitting next to me who spoke perfect English, and we were talking, and he said, well, Russians are going to love to have Putin because he's an authoritarian leader, and Russians prefer an authoritarian leader. That's just the way we are. We believe that country should be run by some strong person that runs the country, and you will just see that will keep happening. We can't really do democracy. And I didn't know what to think, really, because I grew up thinking, well, everybody wants democracy. I mean, democracy is the right thing to do. But it really made me realize something that I just said a few minutes ago, is that how a country is the conception of how the people in the country conceive it to be. And so for all the warmth and wonderfulness of the people in Russia, their history has been to have autocratic rulers. They were separate from Europe, and they were ruled by basically the Mongols for centuries, who have a Khan, an absolute ruler who's considered to be God. And they were ruled that way for centuries, and it's just kind of embedded in them. So what does that mean for what's happening in Ukraine? It's an example of how difficult having peace and stability really is, because it's a clash of different ways of thinking. The idea of working things out on an international scale and talking to people and looking at what most people want, and going through and trying to get accurate information and things like that. Well, that's not what happened. I mean, the Russians have very inaccurate information about what's going on there. Probably we do too, though I think I've managed to get some good sources. But I think that the Russians are going to lose, and I think that that'll cause some instability in itself, because it's a pretty big country right on the borders of Europe. So I think it's going to be a while before this situation sorts itself out. And sadly, I think we're going to keep seeing things like this for a long, long, long time. I don't see that people are going to anytime soon switch to thinking of this as one world where we work out our problems together.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what you want to share with our audience, and specifically, what do you mean restoring securities? I think these things we need to analyze more.
Well, I kind of agree with Donald that
Professor
I'm
Rob.
not sure restoring security is the way to look at this. Because you can't really restore something you didn't necessarily ever have. So the nature of conflict between the nations of the world often comes down to resources and triggers. The First World War was caused by a kid killing the Archduke of Ferdinand, and then triggering a bunch of alliances as different countries went to war and the alliances kicked in, with the U.S. remaining neutral. The Second World War occurred largely due to appeasement that resulted from the First World War. The French and British kind of agreed with the Germans that they'd overreached with the rules out of the Treaty of Versailles, and that Germany was being treated unfairly, and so allowed Germany to build up military strength, move into Czechoslovakia, and then when Germany said, "Yeah, well, I'm going to start taking everything," they were ill prepared for war, and again it grew to global proportions. Japan was being constrained, blockaded by the U.S., and saw as their only way out some way to cripple or neuter the United States so they could do what the hell they wanted to do. And it was to a large extent a fight of resources. Germany's tagline during the Second World War was Lebensraum, or living room. And the idea that they were expanding because Germany needed extra space. Russia in the current Ukraine battle argues that they need Ukraine as a buffer against NATO. Though I think the real reason is Putin wants to rebuild the USSR and feels the collapse of the USSR was one of the greatest disasters for Russia in Russian history. So in the end, it kind of comes down to a fight over control and a fight over resources, and we have the same kind of triggers that created the First World War in place now. The NATO is a massive alliance. If any of the NATO countries are attacked, the entire NATO mechanism kicks in, and you have world war. The U.S. is part of the NATO response mechanism, which is kind of, I think, somewhat unusual, because the U.S. is geographically removed from Europe, so we're probably one of the furthest NATO participants. But regardless of that, we would be pulled into the conflict, and immediately you'd have a world war. And so then you get escalation of weaponry as both sides in a conflict build for what they hope will be deterrence, but may not be deterrence. You start building these weapons, and of course now we've got nuclear weapons, and the concern that Putin will make good on his threats to start using tactical nuclear weapons as he loses in Russia. Right now he's gaining ground, so little likelihood he's going to do it. But his entire existence is now on a precipice where if he fails at this, he's probably going to be removed from office. And there's a lot of speculation that suggests that if he's removed from office, his life probably won't go on much after that. So he has a real reason to participate in this conflict. One, because he believes the USSR should be rebuilt, and it appears to be his dream to rebuild it. And number two, now that he started it, if he tries to exit it, he's probably not going to survive either politically or physically that particular act. And so he's up against a wall and can't remove himself from it. And we've got weapons potentially in play that could do a substantial amount of damage to the planet. And then what would happen if NATO jumps in? Would China jump in on the side of Russia? Certainly North Korea would probably become active. Iran would probably become active. The level of the conflict could grow. Some nations jumping in opportunistically, others by the nature of the various alliances that they currently hold, and we'd have a world war. And so the practical matter is we don't have a great mechanism to prevent this. The League of Nations during the First World War failed spectacularly. The United Nations is a paper tiger. To a large extent, anybody on the Security Council can largely block the United Nations from taking any serious action. And of course, we've got people on countries on both sides on the Security Council that would be unwilling to let the United Nations do what is its job. And so until and unless the controlling mechanisms are fixed, I mean, if you think about it, what we really need is a way to keep governments in line, much like we have. And the United Nations is supposed to be that way. The World Court is supposed to be that way, but they lack the authority and the capability to enforce the rulings. And so you can certainly have a legal action, but without some type of a mechanism to assure enforcement, that legal action has very little weight. And when it comes to wars, neither the World Court nor the United Nations have the capability of enforcement, and so they rely on the member states to do that. And if the member states are involved in war, well, I mean, they kind of become part of the problem and not part of the solution. So what we need, and of course, we'd have to be sure that this didn't become some type of problem in and of itself, because certainly we see law enforcement at a small scale in many countries has become problematic. Here in the United States, particularly of late. Now we grow a law enforcement agency with the power to control nations, who then would assure that law enforcement agency wouldn't in and of itself be a problem. How would we make sure it didn't misact or overact and become a bigger problem than the problems that it's attempting to overcome? So this is not an easy thing to fix by any nature. You've got countries with massive weapons capability on hair triggers and willing to respond violently to either a real or imagined threat. The Russia didn't need to take out Ukraine for a buffer. It's silliness, and even so doing, it wouldn't be an efficient buffer against NATO, and NATO's capabilities would still massively exceed Russia's. So even with Ukraine, so in the end, it wouldn't be an effective. I mean, Russia would have to continue, and the only way they continue after Ukraine is to enter into NATO territory, which would cause the conflict that they supposedly were trying to avoid by annexing Ukraine. And so the path they're on will not result in the outcome that they hope for, even if they're successful. These flaws in judgment cover pretty much the whole gamut of how wars first come to be and why it's very difficult to curtail them once they've started. So what we need is a mechanism that makes wars massively and obviously unprofitable, untenable for the countries that begin it. And we certainly it certainly has been no lack of trying. The level of sanctions being passed on Russia as a result of this war are unprecedented. But the fact is, they're not only able to weather them, they've been able to get around them using third parties to ferry their goods out of the country and avoid the sanctions. And again, the UN and the aligned nations have been so far unable to curtail this, largely because many of the aligned nations need a lot of the goods that Russia produces. So if you're going to fix this, one, make nations self-dependent. In other words, give them the ability to be independent. So at least if you use the sanction method, they're not cutting off their nose to spite their face, which really was what was happening with Russia, particularly with regard to oil and natural gas. The nations providing the sanctions needed those things, particularly for a long, cold winter. And so were unwilling to do, or at least assure, that the sanctions took hold and Russia could be as badly crippled as they'd hoped it would be. If they were energy independent, if they weren't dependent on Russia, then the sanctions would have had far more weight and might have done the job that they were intended to do. But they weren't, because interdependence resulted. But now, if you create each nation that's independent, they now have no reason to interoperate or collaborate with each other, then you increase the chance of conflict, because the nations aren't in a collaborative structure, and so the loss of that collaborative structure doesn't cause them any pain. So again, even if we create a fix for the kinds of problems we're having in Russia and Ukraine, we actually do create what may be another and potentially bigger problem, because we reduce collaboration between nations. And when you reduce collaboration between nations, you remove one of the elements that prevents war in the first place. So this is not by any means easily. I guess if I were to do it, one is, if you have the United Nations should have the teeth to enforce the rules that it passes. All of the nations on the Security Council should step down. Security Council should be removed, and each nation should be treated as a participant in the overall process. And that way, if a majority of the participants in a democratic fashion resolve to do something, the United Nations can act and do it. At least the forces under the United Nations command can then become an enforcement body that can act against even the countries that are currently now on the Security Council. But do you think Russia, the US, China are going to agree with that? No, because each one wants to protect their own sovereignty. So getting that done looks to be impossible. The concept of mutually assured destruction, that's just nuts. I mean, it works short term until it doesn't. But holding weapons that could destroy the planet under the hope that somebody's going to be reasonable and not use them. We've all grown up with an awful lot of unreasonable people, and a lot of those unreasonable people make it into politics. I mean, we can go to any one of our countries and see people in politics and in power that probably belong in prison, and you don't want to give them a red button to push that could cause massive conflicts or destroy the planet. Yet that's the path we are on now. We just moved the doomsday clock. I think it's not 90 seconds to midnight, and what was one of the most boring presentations I think I've seen in my life. There's nothing like a bunch of scientists standing up next to a clock that's not moving, saying, "Look, we've got 90 seconds until we all die." Except it's not 90 seconds. It's nobody cares. So in the end, a lot of the mechanisms we've got currently to prevent war and conflict are not working. And so one, we need to make them work. Number two, we need to assure that the reasons why nations go to war with each other are reduced. And number three, these hair triggers we've got that could start global conflicts, we really need to make sure that they're mitigated far better than they currently are. The fact that somebody can make a decision to invade without any safety mechanisms or without immediate worldwide response to the act is problematic. And so fixing those three things, I think, would make progress to assuring peace going forward. Wouldn't be perfect. Nothing that's done politically is perfect, but it would be better than what we currently have.
Thank you. Professor Donald, do you have any different ideology or thoughts about this?
Well, I think
global peace?
David's really right about how international organizations don't have any power to really adjudicate or enforce anything. I know, I guess they can adjudicate because they can declare people to be war criminals or, do whatever that they do. But I mean, what does that do? I mean, that's just bad boy. You shouldn't have done that. I mean, it doesn't really have any effect. I know that the United Nations does have a small force that they use to go in to countries that have already that basically agree to allow them to come in where there's been conflicts, and they're trying to tamp down the conflicts. Right now, I mean, one of the way the Israelis are, have a hyper nationalistic government right now that's hyper nationalistic and hyper religious, who are saying, well, Jerusalem is ours. It's been ours since 2000 BC, and so we're going to take it back and kick everybody out that we don't like. The people who've lived there for a long, long time don't want to be kicked out, and so and then again, that's what I was saying, is that whatever's in people's head that they think is true, and it's what they believe. How do you get into their heads and change that? I mean, it's not, they talk to all their friends, their family, everybody they know, they all agree with each other, and they all know it's true that that Jerusalem is theirs. It's in the Bible. It must be true. And so right now, because of this hyper nationalism that's going on, and it's happening, sadly, there's nationalist groups even in Finland, and the most egalitarian countries have these smaller but very active hyper nationalist groups. So it's not something that we can. That's what I'm talking about the kind of micro problem, is that when you get into that, what you have to change is individuals. But there's people talk about turning around the ocean liner. They say, oh, it's like trying to turn around an ocean liner, but it's not. It's like trying to turn around 8 billion kayaks. I mean, it's not. You can't. Every single person on Earth is rowing their kayak in their own direction for their own purposes, and so world peace and stability is it's not something that can happen too easily. One thing that we can do, though, and we can do starting tomorrow or today, in theory, is start working on the incredible disparity. Because Oxfam came out with a report just a few weeks ago that the top 1% gained 2/3 as much wealth in the last 2 years as everyone else combined. Two times as much wealth in the last 2 years as everyone else combined. And the disparity in wealth is getting so incredible that the top 1% of people are controlling literally almost everything, and the rest of us just have crumbs. And that really hurts stability, because if people have enough to eat, and people have a place to live, and people have good health, and they know that their children are going to be safe, they're far less likely to want to go out and fight with people and wreck things, because if things are going well, you don't really want to wreck them. So I think that if we talk about global peace and stability, the place to start, that way that you can get down to the individual level and really start working on getting the kayaks going in a reasonable direction, is ask the question, what is it that person on that kayak needs to feel that they're safe and comfortable. And that's, and we're right now, the world is going in the opposite direction at a very fast clip, which is kind of scary because we have enough. The Oxfam report said that if we taxed all the billionaires and 100 millionaires at 5%, we'd have enough money to lift, what was it? Something like 1.7 billion people out of poverty. And I think if we did that and it'd be nothing to them. I mean, they own 90% of the world's wealth. And so they would only own 85% of the world's wealth. Oh, boo-hoo. And 1.7 billion people is almost a fifth of the people on Earth, or it's a sixth of the people on Earth. And if a sixth of the people on Earth weren't worried every day if they could feed their children, they'd be a lot less likely to want to change things in violent ways. And I think that's the key to world peace and stability. So there.
Thank you, Professor Rob.
Yeah, it's a mess. If you look at how we might have prevented the war in Ukraine, just take the most recent one. One would, and you want to use technology, better information, better ability to do simulation might have done that. Russia came into the battle thinking that they could sweep in, take the capital of Ukraine in a lightning strike. It would be over before the NATO powers could react. And don't get me wrong, the West kind of concluded that was probably what was going to happen. Russia was going to come in, it was going to take over the capital. Ukraine's leadership didn't believe, they thought Russia was bluffing. Russia thought they could do this. Ukraine clearly didn't think they could do it. The West thought they could. Event happened. Russia's military was nowhere near where Russia thought it would be, let alone where the rest of the world thought it would be. It failed spectacularly due to corruption, due to poor maintenance, due to whatever. They just completely pratfalled. I mean, at the very end, the Russian military turned out to be a paper tiger, and had Russia itself known that, it wouldn't have entered into the conflict. It would have just been stupid. And Putin's a lot of things, but he may be insane, but he's not stupid. So on the other hand, if Ukraine had taken the fact that Russia really believed they could do this seriously, they would have levied a much stronger defense and asked for help early on, and maybe more aggressively tried to join NATO and had a chance of actually being part of NATO when it happened and had better defense. So both countries did a poor job of anticipating what was going to happen, and that poor job resulted in an avoidable conflict. So right now, given the state of modern weapons and what we're learning at the moment, the kinds of conventional wars that people have been trained on in the military and governments think they can execute are to a large extent non-viable. The only way a war to take territory works is if you are substantially stronger against the country you're going after, and if that country has no alliances it can call on to equip itself and fight back. U.S.'s war in the Middle East, that kind of worked out, but only from a military standpoint. From an economic standpoint, it was a disaster for the United States. The cost of the peace that was after the war. I still remember the generals that were talking in front of Congress and getting them said, "Yeah, you got to realize that it's going to cost us more after the war is over than the war cost." And those generals that said that were removed from office and laughed off the stadium, even though it turned out they were absolutely right. So ability to better think through the implications of the war, what comes after, how individually it will hurt your personal prospects politically, would, I think, do a much better job on preventing avoidable wars than we have now. The wars we've seen recently were to a large extent the result of bad intelligence. The WMDs in Iraq didn't exist. The military power that Russia thought it had didn't exist. The protection that Ukraine thought it had didn't exist. And had all those parties, had all those things been known, the Iraq War wouldn't have happened with the U.S. And the Ukraine War wouldn't have happened to begin with. And so providing a much greater degree of intelligence may prevent a lot of the conflicts that we have. At least if you better understand the problem you're trying to overcome, then perhaps you can be more effective at trying to overcome it. And you may find that trying to solve the problem politically has a far higher chance of succeeding than militarily. Russia has been very successful in turning governments in their favor over time, and without anywhere near the blowback that the war in Ukraine caused. They just have to be patient. Now, that's doesn't mean, because that's something that we want to happen, that we should allow it. But that does suggest there are more peaceful ways to accomplish things, even though that we may not agree with what the foreign government wants to accomplish. So I think better intelligence, better ability and more accurate ability to do simulation, and certainly a better understanding of the nation's own capabilities would result in far fewer conflicts, certainly far fewer avoidable conflicts. Going back to Sun Tzu, who I like to quote on and off. His comment was that if you know yourself and you know your opponent, you will win 1,000 battles. If you don't know either one of those things, you're going to lose every time. And if you don't know one of them, you probably won't succeed either. So in the end, intelligence is key. And if the intelligence organizations are allowed to step up, they probably can be more effective than any other organization in terms of external organizations, in terms of preventing an avoidable war and finding a more peaceful path to accomplishing what is a political agenda. So in the end, it may very well be the path that we're on to increase computational capability, being able to better and more accurately derive information we don't have through simulation, can result in a far more peaceful world, because conflicts, and if we look at the conflicts that have been in recent history, were conflicts that should not have occurred in the first place. If we agree that's the case, then better intelligence would showcase that up front and prevent the conflict from occurring in the first place. One other thing that we probably need to address, though, is the military-industrial complex that makes its money off of wars and has huge influence in governments. And it's undoubtedly a bad idea to let companies that make money on war influence the governments to declare them. That there should undoubtedly be a hard break between those two elements in terms of conflict. Because there's a plant in the United States that has Putin's picture on their wall because they were due to be shut down. They build parts for M1A1 tanks, and the company was going out of business. Thanks to this conflict, they're doing great. So they're big fans of Putin. So the tongue in cheek, I'm not suggesting they're traitors, but in the end, making money off conflict, the people that make money off conflict probably should not have any influence on the people that declare conflict. That would be a great way to apply separation of duties and assure that wars are not created for individual economic gain, which would be problematic. So a combination of better intelligence and eliminating the influence of those that produce weapons on governments, those two things could have prevented the wars that we've had in more recent years. And making those happen would probably do a great deal to improve security and safety.
Thank you. What's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I think that simulation might help. I know that one of the problems right now with anything that we do with things like simulations or artificial intelligence is that the results we get are only as good as the data that we have to use to get the results. And I think it seems to me that Putin would be smart enough to build a simulation in his head if he had some sort of a accurate representation of what his resources actually were. And I think that's been a problem with autocratic systems and ones that have kind of centralized command and control. I remember Russia, the Soviet Union was famous for doing things like building far more tractors than they could possibly use because they had such poor information about what it was that they actually needed. And they were famous for doing things like that. And so I'm not sure that the people who feed the information to the simulations would do a very good job in Russia, but in principle, that does seem like a good idea, and I agree with Rob that it would be nice to start doing things based on information instead of intuition, like especially Putin's intuition about rebuilding the Soviet Union, which didn't work before, and I don't see why it worked now. Anyway, I'm still going back to this thing about income inequality and disparity, because if you look at kind of maybe one of the fundamental things is Ukraine has some valuable resources. Apparently, it's got a fairly good natural gas that they've discovered and some things like that. And of course, Russia makes all of its money basically with petroleum exports. And so if they could grab some more petroleum exports from Ukraine and Ukraine didn't become a competitor to them, then that would benefit Russia. And so and I guess as long as the world's a zero-sum game where, if Ukraine has more than Russia has less, then we're always going to get in a position like that. And I think Rob pointed out earlier, I think it was Rob, it might have been somebody else, but that a lot of wars are over resources. So when you get into the wars in Africa and things like that, a lot of times somebody will have diamonds or somebody will have cadmium or whatever like that. And oil is one of the most common, of course, to fight over. And it goes back to the thing that when somebody has a lot and somebody else has less, and it's not being distributed in a fair way, it's very, very destabilizing, and it happens on a global basis. So the only real answer is for people to work things out on a global basis. So in this imaginary fantasy perfect world where there was global peace and security, Russia and Ukraine would have addressed the real problem at the beginning and said, okay, here's the deal. And they could have formed a mini OPEC with each other or done all kinds of things. But, if they looked at the real problem and addressed the real problem, and they, in the fantasy real world, they would have looked at how it fit into the world in general, because the world in general, oil companies know this. They're getting into wind and solar and things like that because they know their goose is cooked. They know that the transition away from petroleum is going to succeed. They know that no matter what, they're going to run out of oil. It's going to happen. That they are not a forever business, and they know that. And so Russia and Ukraine, Russia has to learn that too. And the only way that that can work for them is to work together with everybody else. So what has to happen is that people have to start working together at a country level. And that's something Dr. Talib says every time he's here, is that we have to start working together as nations and solving these problems on a global basis. And sadly, right now, we're kind of going the opposite direction in a lot of places. But I think that I'm kind of seeing that, like, younger people especially have grown up like talking to people everywhere in the world through the internet, and some of their prejudices are just not as strong. They don't understand, why it is they're not supposed to like somebody that they've been playing, World of Warcraft with for 10 years. They just don't get it. And so that's a bit of a hope. But as far as I can see, that's really the only way, is to start working together and lowering income inequality. So that's what we need to do.
Thank you, Professor Rob. What's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, that'll make a good point in terms of if you're running a simulation and the data sucks, you're still going to screw up. I mean, there's a certain amount of irony to the fact that Putin is an ex-spook, and failure in Ukraine was a failure of intelligence. It's like this should have been his area of expertise, and so having him fail in what was his area of expertise does point to what happens often, whether you're talking about an autocratic government or an autocratic management organization or company. I wrote one of the papers that spoke to why IBM nearly went under in the early 90s. And to a large extent, it was due to the fact that only good information made it, and I say good information, only information that wouldn't make the then CEO upset made it to him. And he was completely isolated from all the things that were going on in the company. And even though on paper he was one of the smartest CEOs that IBM ever had, they treated him like a mushroom. They kept him in the dark and fed him crap. So his decisions were bad. And you can clearly see from the standpoint of the war in Ukraine that Putin was fed a bunch of crap. And so he made a decision based on bad intelligence, which he should have known better to look underneath, given that was the job he used to have. But that comes to confirmation bias. And we've all got it, and that's the desire to see or accept information that agrees with what we want to hear, and reject information regardless of its truth on both sides. That doesn't agree with what we want to hear. We want to invade Ukraine, then all that information says, yeah, we're just going to roll in and take them out. They're weak. That's all good information. Then he pops up and says, yeah, but the general's been spending. There's a lot of corruption, and we're not really sure the stuff's ready to go. And yeah, well, that's bullshit. That's fake news. Everybody's loyal Russian. We're going to go in and do it. And so you can just see how he's just screwed himself throughout the entire process. And so if we are talking about simulation intelligence, it really has to be an assurance that it's good information and intelligence, because the war in Iraq was, of course, caused by bad information and intelligence on WMDs that didn't exist. Because our government in the United States, that was what they wanted to hear. They wanted to take out Iraq. A lot of reasons. I don't have the time to go into them here. And that's the information they accepted, and off they went in what was largely a mission to remove something that didn't exist in the first place. So just a complete waste of time and money. And it certainly didn't make the world a safer place in the end of it. So in the end, one of the big things I still think that we could use to fix this is making sure that the people that are making decisions based on the best information that's available, and that the mechanisms currently in place to assure that countries don't misact and will be punished for acting criminally are strengthened and made relevant again. Without doing those things, those two things, we're going to continue to have conflicts, and most of them undoubtedly will be mistaken conflicts. The country's individuals will regret after they've done them, and if we can't make them regret those, see that that's the outcome before they make the decisions, then they're going to go ahead and make them, and we're going to continue to have discussions about how to fix a problem that apparently nobody wants to take the effort to fix. So thank you, Sharif. That's my final comment.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. This is excellent discussion when we think about global peace and restoring securities. And I am sure our audience learn a lot of things from what before and I just want to share a good news that yesterday we met with uh, five one biggest district. It has five different like part of the districts and it has 2 million people. So World Talent Economy Forum, beside this dialogue, we will develop different kind of projects. Definitely.
Sharif, you're breaking up really badly. We're not even getting complete sentences anymore.
Too bad. It was sounded
Thank you
interesting.
everyone. Thank you everyone for joining.
Bye. Have a great week, Rob. See you.